I'm really pleased to have the two scholars who we have here with us today. One who's doing a little bit of a tour of Oregon, and another who's been here with us for many decades. We've been asked sometimes about why do we do history that focuses on negative aspects of our past, and I think, one, I would encourage you to read Dr. Ward's book because he addresses that question at the end of it really beautifully. But I think it's important for an organization like ours to make sure that we pay attention to everything that happened in Oregon and United States history that continues to have a legacy and an impact on our lives today. And I think histories like the kind we're going to discuss today can be very difficult, I think, for us to hear, but I also personally find that there is a pleasure in having that knowledge because it helps me understand the world that I'm in much better. So I hope that you all feel the same. So on the far left here is Dr. Darrell Millner, who's a longtime teacher and a sometimes chair of the Black Studies Department at Portland State University, also really a founder of that department at PSU. He's quite modest. His research interest is in Black history and race relations in the American West, with a special focus on Oregon Black history. He's published on York of the Core of Discovery with the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And I have to say a personal thanks. He is an advisor in at least two major projects for the Oregon Historical Society right now, and we really couldn't do our work without him. So thank you very much, Dr. Millner. We're really pleased to have Dr. Jason Morgan Ward, who's currently a professor of history at Mississippi State University, where he teaches modern United States history. He's a native of northeastern North Carolina, and he received his bachelor's degree from Duke University and a PhD in history from Yale. Oxford University Press released his most recent book, Hanging Bridge, Racial Violence and America's Civil Rights Century, in May 2016. It is for sale in the museum store. Your OHS member discount does apply. The book has received awards from the Mississippi Historical Society and the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters. During the 2013-14 academic year, he completed a residential fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Humanities Forum. His first book, Defending White Democracy, The Making of a Segregationist Movement and the Remaking of Racial Politics, was published in 2011 by UNC Press. His commentary on race, violence, and civil rights has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the American Historian. Before receiving his doctorate in history, he was an elementary school teacher in Sunflower County, Mississippi. He lives in Starkville, Mississippi with his wife, historian Allison Collis Green, and two sons, Amos and Theo. So Dr. Ward is going to begin by giving us some overview from his book, and then the two will just have a conversation, and we'll invite you all to join in as well. So please join me in welcoming Jason Morgan Ward and Darrell Millner.
Hi, thanks for coming out. I want to talk about... Okay. There's a couple of things I'd like to talk about which come out of what I've learned from this book project and that hopefully relate to the Black experience in Oregon and Oregon history, and more specifically. And those two themes are really the emergence of a national civil rights movement or a national civil rights network in the 20th century, and how that's directly related to the politics of Black migration and the reality of Black migration. And I do this, I learned about this, and I approached this through the lens of a single lynching site, a bridge where African Americans were lynched in southern Mississippi during the World War I era, quadruple lynching of 2 young men, 2 young women, and a double lynching in the World War II era in 1942 of 2 boys roughly the same age as Emmett Till. One had just turned 15, one was still 14. And having a singular site of racial violence provides a measuring stick, a yardstick of how race and civil rights politics are changing over the course of the early 20th century. And part of the challenge and what makes the project continue to be endlessly fascinating and challenging is that I get the opportunity to do these talks, a lot of them in the South, but some of them across the country. And no presentation is ever the same, because I take very seriously and really enjoy the challenge of trying to make it relevant and connect it to the history of wherever I'm at. That a town of with a population of 700 in rural Mississippi can connect so concretely and directly to the Black experience across the country is something that I'm continually inspired by and encouraged by when I do these presentations. And practically speaking, this just continues to bear out and bear fruit. So I gave a presentation at Oregon State last night as part of their Holocaust Memorial Week, which was a new and different way to approach this particular project, my particular project. But during the Q&A, one of the three attendees, I think three attendees who were African American, one of whom was a student, one of whom is a colleague of mine from Mississippi. The third was a retired African American gentleman who'd spent his career in Seattle, that served in the military and relocated to Seattle, who's from Shibuya, Mississippi. So they find me seemingly wherever I go, and it proves once again that this process of migration and connection is something that really continues on in the lived experience of people. People continue to move. People continue to take their histories with them and to stay connected and reconnect to that history. And of course, Mississippi, racial violence in Mississippi, racial violence in the Deep South matters across the nation. And really, as we enter into the American century, the 20th century, this is increasingly becoming a national issue and a national story. This little town of Shibuya has a population of roughly 700. I believe that's roughly the circulation of the Portland New Age, African-American newspaper in Portland at the turn of the century. So we're talking about a similar scale in terms of a community, an engaged community, and a community that feels a direct connection to this type of violence. And the fact that this violence is something that's being monitored and discussed and condemned across the country shows the real concrete reach of Black migration. We think about the Great Migration and the sheer numbers and scope of the Great Migration and the destinations that the bulk of Black migrants go to, places like Chicago and Detroit and New York and Philadelphia. But it doesn't take a groundswell. It doesn't take tens of thousands moving to really spread this community of protest and this community of commitment to racial change in the United States. In the case of Portland, it took a few hundred people with newspaper subscriptions to mobilize and to keep these stories alive. And these stories of racial violence become stories that are intensely important to African Americans across the country, both because of the politics of civil rights, and also just the deep personal connections that link this network together. And those are connections of migration. And moments of crisis, moments of racial violence, moments of brutal atrocities are moments that really galvanize Black communities across the country. And the fact that those communities are growing and spreading has tremendous political consequences, that these incidents have been occurring for decades, but having African Americans strategically placed in northern states, western states, with electoral votes, with urban politicians who are suddenly having to confront the fact that they have Black voters that they have to answer to. There's a political traction that African Americans are gaining nationally that has a great deal to do with why we're paying more attention to racial violence. And we're paying attention to racial violence because Black activists and their allies are elevating and exposing these stories of tremendous violence. That has everything to do with stories like this quadruple lynching in 1918 in Mississippi. It also matters that we're at war, and we're ostensibly at war for democracy, and we're at war against terrible violators of human rights and human dignity. And that brings with it a certain diplomatic calculus that you have to keep in mind when you're talking about racial violence at home and the ways in which you're not living up to your ideals. So that quadruple lynching in 1918 matters significantly. And it makes national news, not just in the black press, but in mainstream white outlets like the New York Times. And I want to talk specifically about a couple people who are children of the migration, who are migrants themselves, people who I found in doing this project, and the links I connected back to not just Mississippi, but to the specific corner of Mississippi. This is a man named James Yates. We know about James Yates because in the 80s, when he was an elderly man, he wrote a memoir. James Yates had migrated from the South, from rural Mississippi, from a community not too far from the Hanging Bridge in Shibuya, Mississippi. He had joined the labor movement. He was a lefty. He was one of 100 African Americans who defy American law and diplomatic diplomacy by going to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He's part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, an illegal but integrated military volunteer unit. So that's why we have his memoir. But his memoir starts out in rural Clark County, Mississippi. And it starts with the story of his childhood, his family, and how he ends up leaving this corner of the rural South. And there a couple things about this are important. One is that even before he decides that he's going to leave, the black migration and the search that African Americans embark on for community, for areas of the country where they can have dignity and independence and a shot at a prosperous life for themselves and their families, is something that his family is already dealing with in rural Mississippi. His uncle migrates to Oklahoma, where they're founding all black communities. He had relatives who were exodusters, his mother's family, who sought out a new life in Kansas after the Civil War. His father goes out to Oklahoma, and things don't pan out, but he stays with his mother and his grandmother in this little town of Shibuya while they're gone. So his memoir is full of family members who are experimenting with migration and testing out other areas of the country, new frontiers where perhaps things are going to be better for them than in rural Mississippi. His uncle, who settles in Oklahoma, actually becomes a Garveyite, and as he says in the memoir, keeps writing letters home about this ship that's going to take him to Africa, right? So this is this migratory imagination really knows no limits. But for him, his migration story is quite specific. He's a child when there's this mass lynching at this river bridge 10 miles from his house. By the time the rumors and the stories trickle up to this black rural community he lives in, the numbers have expanded to, I think, 9 dead, right? So again, these stories of violence take on even greater life. And after he hears this story, he says he has but one obsession, and that's to get north, to get out of here, which he ultimately does, dodging white policemen at train stations who've been ordered to keep black folks off of northbound trains. This is Walter White, NAACP staffer, very light-skinned, blonde hair, blue-eyed, son of light-skinned African Americans from Atlanta, who investigates lynchings undercover, including, I think, in Shibuya's the third time he goes south, poses as a white man, and gets the sordid details that used to not trickle out as much about lynchings because they were being reported by white officials who were passing along information to the white press. The numbers bear out that racial violence and conditions in the South are clearly deeply connected to migration patterns, and nowhere is this more dramatic than during the teens in Mississippi. I mean, the numbers bear it out. A 7% population decline, accounting for a natural increase, childbirth, is suggesting that, tens of thousands of people are leaving, and they're leaving rapidly. 7% statewide is often pointed to as kind of a expression of how profound this migration was, that Mississippi experiences a 7% drop in its black population, a black majority state that will very relatively soon not be a black majority state because of the scope of this migration. But if you look at pockets of the state where there are notorious incidents of racial violence, you see that those numbers are even more dramatic. So in the county that I'm looking at, when I crunched the numbers, it was a 30% drop in a single decade, the decade in which this horrible lynching occurs. We know this is significant because we start to see whites, even in places like Mississippi, who are launching propaganda efforts and public relations campaigns aimed at keeping African Americans from leaving. They're even trying to set up bureaus in places like St. Louis and Chicago to lure them back. So if you read white papers, you don't see a lot of stuff about horrible lynchings, but you do start to see articles about how badly the South needs black labor and how, you know, African Americans are going north and deciding that maybe Mississippi's not so bad after all. So there's a narrative that's happening in the white press which doesn't like to talk about African Americans at all in these communities, that's forced to acknowledge that this is an issue, that migration is a problem. And then on the other hand, you have a strategic decision by the black press, particularly in the urban north, but also civil rights organizations and advocates who are really playing up racial violence as a proximate cause of the black migration. Any historian will tell you to beware of the single cause explanation for anything. And there are African American historians who love to argue about the approximate causes of the Great Migration. But one thing that is definitely clear is that advocates for civil rights and fair treatment of African Americans are hitting this argument hard, right? And the narrative is about how it's hitting white Southerners in their pocketbooks, that they're losing money for this, that the way to counter racial violence is not just to shame and embarrass, but also to emphasize that these white folks in the South are shooting themselves in the foot. And there are some examples and some evidence that you start to have whites create a new rhetoric and a new narrative that is about maintaining their economy, which white supremacy and the subjugation of African Americans is supposed to serve and prop up. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, really embraces this argument and this warning to the South that the South is really destroying itself and destabilizing its economy by allowing this kind of horrible violence to go unchecked. This is, I think, the signal presentation and my message that the society put up online. But this really says it all. Like, why are blacks leaving the South? It's the reason, right? It's the single cause, right? That is as much a civil rights strategy, a political argument, as it is some sort of academic theory. The N in NAACP is very important as well because this is a national organization that is founded at the end of the first decade of the 20th century in this period of growing migration, both because they are intent on establishing a national network of civil rights advocacy and support, and they're doing so because of the recognition that we increasingly have a national African American population, right? We're going into a century where at the beginning 90+% of black Americans live in the South. And very quickly, that percentage starts to trickle down as African Americans migrate across the country. So there's a recognition that the black community is increasingly a national community, but there's another side to this national recognition, and that's that racial violence is increasingly national. So if we had to pinpoint a proximate cause for the founding of a National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, if it was the Southern Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the spikes in lynching through the end of the 19th century would have been a great time to start an organization for civil rights reform. But it's the realization that as African Americans are migrating out of the South, they're being met with racial violence wherever they go that is the proximate cause for the organization of the NAACP. Most notably, a horrible race riot in Springfield, Illinois, just a few months before the founding the formal founding in 1909 of the organization. This is also a time where lynching, mob violence is becoming increasingly racial and increasingly regional in its character. I think that's very important for the history of a state like Oregon, because one of the things that's very true in how Americans view lynching and rationalize mob violence over the course of our history is that it's rooted in this myth of frontier justice and the fact that whenever Americans find themselves separated from legal mechanisms and law enforcement, that they're compelled to take matters into their own hands. And this is kind of a popular notion and myth of where mob violence comes from that I'd be happy to pick apart at another point in time. But what is true increasingly is that racial violence, certainly by the 20th century, is increasingly regional in nature. And when it's not regional in nature, when it's not a Southern phenomenon, it is most definitely a racial phenomenon that's aimed primarily at African Americans and other vulnerable communities. It's also on the decline. That says something about this civil rights activism, this public awareness campaign, and also the very real pressure that communities and states find themselves under to have some official response or answer to unchecked mob violence and horrible brutality that we now are learning more about through the advocacy and investigations of civil rights organizations who are putting out statistics. Tuskegee Institute, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they are studying these crimes, they are investigating these crimes, and they are getting that information out to the American public to really challenge some of these myths, like lynching being some sort of vigilante justice. When the law fails you, you have to take it into your own hands. So really challenging some of these deeply held notions about lynching and why we should ever accept it as justified. Certainly by the World War II era, when we have another horrible atrocity at this singular site, this river bridge in Mississippi, again, the diplomatic calculus of this is very apparent in the way that civil rights organizations are approaching this, that we're fighting Nazis, yet we're allowing these kinds of atrocities and racial hatred to run amok. That's significant. The fact that these are papers in places like Harlem and south side of Chicago, Seattle, LA, that are publicizing this, that are printing post-mortem photos, wire photos of the two boys who were killed across the country, that we're spreading and making people aware and applying pressure, is significant. And that brings me to my second biographical sketch, and then I'll get out of the way. And that's the story of a man named Roy Wilkins. So Roy Wilkins in 1942 is a journalist who writes a column for that same newspaper in Harlem, the Amsterdam Star News. And again, this is him making the double victory argument, civil rights advocates during World War II, which is that we're going to fight Nazis abroad and we're going to fight the same hatred and brutality here at home. We're fighting for democracy, whether it's overseas or whether it's in Mississippi. So he's making that argument. He is an NAACP staffer as well as a veteran journalist. By the time Emmett Till is lynched in 1955, he is the new executive secretary of the NAACP. He takes over for Walter White, who leads the organization for 2 decades and who cut his teeth passing as a white man to bring us the gruesome details of dozens of Southern lynchings and race riots. Stamp out Mississippiism, that's what it says. Roy Wilkins' autobiography begins with the words, I wasn't born in Mississippi, but my story begins there all the same. Roy Wilkins was born in St. Louis, Missouri, to black Mississippians, who he goes on to tell the story at the beginning of his autobiography about how his parents leave Mississippi because his dad had a run-in with a white man on a lonely country road, and his father secreted them out of town because word came down that his father was going to be lynched. So his parents are run out of town under threat of lynching. He's born in St. Louis. He goes to live with relatives who had migrated to St. Paul, Minnesota. In 1920, so just after the lynchings that I discussed that happened in Mississippi, he's an undergrad at the University of Minnesota, and he works for the student paper. And he finds himself having to cover a lynching, a brutal lynching, a mob lynching in Duluth, Minnesota. And you can't get much further north than Duluth, Minnesota and still be in the United States. It's 5,000 estimated participated in this triple lynching of 5 employees of a traveling circus. They weren't even residents of Duluth. A similar story to what we often hear in cases of Southern lynchings. There was a rumor that someone had assaulted a white woman, and these 3 men ended up paying for this rumor and these fears with their lives. And so Roy Wilkins, right, a Southern migrant north, as someone who had lived in Kansas City, writing for newspapers, who'd lived in New York, just like Walter White, a native of Atlanta, who had moved north to work for the NAACP, realizes, or James Yates, who moves to Chicago and then goes to Spain, they realize they can't outrun this problem, that this truly is a problem of national reach and national significance. And that hits him in Minnesota when he's having to write in the college newspaper about a lynching in Duluth. He says, we can't outrun this thing, and we certainly can't wish it away. And so we have to stand and fight. And these are the kinds of experiences with racial violence that are deeply personal, that are connections that are forged through migration, that galvanize people for this long fight, this fight that unfolds over the course of the 20th century. And so that's where I'll end for now, but I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you very much.
I got a tough job today. I have to convince people that race and migration has something to do with Oregon. Because you all know that Oregon didn't have those problems. That race is something that happens somewhere else. That migration is not an important part of our Oregon history. So I'm going to try to do that in part by having you share some information with me as I talk about it. In reality, both migration and race have always been important parts of the Oregon story. I didn't see that episode on Fort Langston. So maybe they're going to do it next year. And I'm very glad to see everybody here today because we're going to talk about a very unpleasant part of not only Oregon history, but national history. And that's one reason we don't often talk about it. Talking about race is difficult in America because our racial history has been so horrendous. So we often try to avoid it. But I don't think you can really avoid it and still have an understanding of the kind of history that we've shared as a nation or a location like Portland. So, what does migration and race have to do with Oregon history? Well, Oregon came into the Union in the Civil War generation. It came into the Union when the Union was on the verge of dissolving. The most important issue in the country at the time that Oregon joined it was the issue of slavery, the issue of the status of blacks in the country. And if you talk about slavery, which you cannot avoid if you talk about the history of the country, very quickly you see, as you look at the documents, you hear the stories, you talk about the dynamics and the relationship, is that we have a history of racial violence because slavery in this country has been defined by race. Slavery has existed in many other countries and many other nationalities and many other parts of human history, But in American history, slavery was color-coded. So when we think about slavery, we have to think about the nation's history. We have to think about what that meant in terms of the kind of racial dynamics that would unfold here. And we can't only think about it in the context of places like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. We have to understand that slavery was a part of all of our national story, that before the American Revolution, slavery existed in every colony, not just in the southern colonies. So I want you to look at the first page of the handout that you have. And this is, I think, one of the most important pieces of American history for me in my own journey to try and understand this relationship between race and history and migration. This was a law that was passed in Virginia, probably the most important of the colonial locations before the American Revolution, in 1669. Slavery did not appear in the country in the cotton generations of the 1860s with those associations with people like Lincoln and the Civil War. Slavery has always been a part of the American story. And when you commit yourself to an institution like slavery, as you begin a country, you also commit yourself to a particular path that will emerge just by the dynamics of that institution. In 1669, in Virginia, they passed a law called the Casual Killing Act that had to do with race and slavery. The Casual Killing Act. That's a contradiction in terms, but it was a necessity if you commit yourself to a racially based slave society. The Casual Killing Act simply said, and every colony eventually will adopt it, and later every state will have one like it. Mississippi's Casual Killing Act was in effect until the 1980s, when most of us in this room were still alive. There was the only change that was made was around the time of the Civil War, when, as you read this law that is addressing slaves, they changed slaves to servants. But if you've ever been to Mississippi, you know who they're still talking about. So, under the Casual Killing Act, this law addresses the biggest problem in a slave society. How do you get a slave to work hard? Nobody's going to voluntarily work hard under the conditions of slavery. How do you encourage them? How do you motivate them to work hard? You can't take their money to get them to work hard as a form of punishment because they don't have money. You can't take their freedom. You can't send them to jail because that would be a relief from slavery. You can't encourage a slave to work hard unless you apply physical violence. And so the relationship between slavery and race and physical violence is one that is bred in that institution. So in Virginia in 1669, now you have, as a slave master, permission to kill a slave if you're correcting them, to try and get them to work hard or to obey you. That is the fundamental reality of American racial history. You can't understand race in America without understanding the institution of slavery and how widely dispersed it was in the origins of the country and how long it endured in the country. Now, turn to the next page. When I was asked to do this presentation today, they wanted me to talk about the ways in which our relationship to institutions like slavery and migration were different than in some other parts of the country. First of all, we have to acknowledge that we do have a relationship, but indeed the circumstances of our location, the circumstances of our evolution have created some dissimilarities between Oregon, the Oregon experience, and some other places like Mississippi. One of the dissimilarities, one of the things that's different about Oregon history is not that we didn't have racial violence, but that the original targets of our racial violence were not black people. The original targets of our racial violence were the native population that whites were displacing when they came to Oregon. And what you have on the example of this page is the first racial lynching that took place in the state. It involved the second major American expedition that came to Oregon. We call it the Astoria Party, when a group of fur traders came to Oregon shortly after the Lewis and Clark expedition came here and established the city of Astoria, the oldest city in Oregon. Well, on the way, they had to encounter the native populations that were already in residence here. This incident was when a Native American stole something from that Astoria expedition, and he was lynched for that. Lynched not just to punish him for the theft, but to establish the kind of relationship that would prevail between blacks and Native Americans over the course of the 1800s. It's going to be connected to that same kind of dynamic that is so intimate to that institution of slavery. The application of violence is not just an individual act for an individual perpetrator, it is to establish a relationship between what becomes the dominant culture and the people that are going to be dominated. So, Oregon has a history of racial violence that precedes any significant black population in Oregon, but it's connected to the kind of dynamics that are created in other parts of the country by this institution of slavery, by this rise to white dominance in the country in those colonial and post-colonial years. Turn to the next page, please. Now, a group like the one collected in this room today is going to be more familiar with some aspects of Oregon racial history than a typical Oregon audience will be. You are self-selected. You have an interest in this topic, and probably you've learned a little bit about it or heard a little bit about it from other sources in other places. And one of the things that is very colorful and very now well documented about Oregon racial history is a thing called the Black exclusion laws of the pioneer period. And probably most of you have heard about the concept of black exclusion. It helps explain why Oregon looks the way that it does today. You look around this room, you see few people of color. You look around this city, you see few people of color. You look around the state, you see few people of color. That's not natural. That's an artificial creation of our history. It's not because black people are allergic to rain. Some of us don't like it a whole lot, but that's not why a lot of black people don't live in Oregon. It's not because black people can't live in a rural area. Oregon only has one big city, but Oregon has a lot of country. And black people came to this nation to live in the country. That's where most black people have always lived. So you can't explain Oregon's demographics by reference to our climate or our geography. You have to understand it's an artificial creation of our racial history. It is a product of public policy. And so we have our connection to what's called the Black exclusion law. This is what you're looking at on this page. In 1844, Oregonians simply said that it's illegal for black people to live in the state. Now, who said that? The people who had migrated here to Oregon from other parts of the country. Oregon is a creation of migration. The Black exclusion law, as interesting as it is not the reason why Oregon doesn't have a large black population or a larger black population. We segregate the ways we understand our racial history. We understand that Oregon comes into the Union in the Civil War generation, and we explain the lack of black people here by this Black exclusion law, but the real reason we don't have much of a black population is the institution. Oregon was being settled, black people didn't have a choice of migrating to Oregon, like some of the people who came across the Oregon Trail. They were contained in that institution. They didn't make those decisions or have those opportunities themselves. They didn't get a chance to decide they wanted to come to Oregon. That's why we have such a small black population. In that Oregon Civil War wagon train generation, the country has upwards of 3 million black residents, almost all contained in slavery. They didn't come to Oregon, so we have the Oregon that we live in today. Migration is a part of Oregon history. Sometimes migration stories don't involve those people who go, but those people who can't go. So to understand Oregon's history, we have to connect it to the racial history of the country and institutions like slavery and the politics and the dynamics of slavery that unfold at the same time that Oregon joins the Union. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the exclusion law is something that you can ignore or dismiss. It's not the reason that we don't have a large black population, but it's connected to the racial dynamics of other parts of the country. The punishment for blacks who migrated to Oregon in this time period, you will find in section 7, if you get down to that section. And what you will find is that for those blacks who don't come to the state, or who come to the state and try to say, they will be arrested every 6 months and publicly whipped. whipping is an institution of slavery. It's a part of the concept of slavery, how you control a slave population. So, in spite of a small black presence here, in spite of the likelihood that not very many blacks are going to come, we're still connected to the dynamics of race that are born in that early connection of the institution of slavery and the requirements of slavery that are imposed upon the national consciousness and the national patterns of behavior. So the exclusion law is important, but you have to go beyond it to understand the connection between migration and race in the Oregon story. If you turn to the next page, you know, another typical mistake that we often make because of where we are and when we became a part of the country is to misunderstand our relationship to many of these racial incidents and events that are typical of more racially defined spaces like those southern states. We kind of expect because we do have a small black population and we're so far from the rest of the country and so far from the rest of a large black population center that we're not going to experience the same kind of events, the same kind of issues and problems that are attached to race in other parts of the country. And that would be a mistake. Everything that happened around race in any part of the country, in any time period, happened in Oregon as well. We are connected to the same events, the same dynamics, and the same kind of history that we more generally associate with those kind of southern social problems and issues. And what you have before you is just an example of that. This example comes from a racial lynching that occurs in the Oregon country in the 1860s. This is the Civil War generation. It's from a report of that particular lynching from a little later time period around the turn of the 20th century, but it occurred in a place called Walla Walla, Washington, one of those small towns right on the northern border of Oregon, right close to Oregon, across the Washington border, and it involves a lynching that occurred in that town, in that place, that has many of the same circumstances and many of the same descriptions that you would associate with the kind of lynchings that we've talked about or that were talked about at the beginning of this event. So it's a mistake to believe that Oregon is disconnected from that particular kind of history. We are connected in many ways, and we continue to be connected today. Migration is a part of that story. The people who came to Oregon came with a particular racial mentality, and that racial mentality will be reflected in the evolution of Oregon history as well. We certainly don't have time today to talk about all aspects of that, but we do have to understand that there are those connections. And if we ignore those connections, we create an inability to understand anything about the Oregon that we live in today. Turn to the next page. That racial lynching that you see the example from on the previous page was a part of that vigilante era in the West. And it would be a mistake to claim or to assume that lynchings were only directed at ethnic populations in the West. That was certainly not true. Vigilantism in the West in the years after the Civil War to the turn of the 20th century claimed more white victims than victims of color because the victims of color didn't live in the West. They didn't have the chance and the choice to do that. But we can look at certain aspects, certain episodes in that particular period and see the same patterns that were in place in other parts of the country. If you look at this particular example, this is from a place called Marshfield at the turn of the 20th century. We don't call it Marshfield anymore, we call it Coos Bay. And Coos Bay was an example of a very typical dynamic that was in play in the course of Oregon labor history. Oregon always had a labor problem, but it wasn't a labor problem of the same nature that we saw in the South that was discussed earlier in this presentation. Oregon never had a large resident black population around which labor issues could revolve. Only occasionally do black populations become an important part of Oregon labor history. The best known people in this room probably are familiar with what's called the Vanport experience. In World War II, blacks were recruited to Oregon to work in the shipyards around and around a federal housing project called Vanport that was built to house those shipyard workers. Between 1942 and 1945, upwards of 20,000 blacks were recruited to Oregon for that purpose. That represented a multiplying of Oregon's previous black population by 10. But that wasn't the only example of that kind of pattern in Oregon labor history. Oregon's labor history was whenever there was a particular job that needed labor to be done, they were willing to recruit blacks in other parts of the country and migrate them here voluntarily to fulfill those labor needs. Vanport was the largest and the most best-known example. But in Marshfield, at the turn of the 20th century, coal, not gold, but coal with a C, had been discovered in the hills around Marshfield. And coal needs labor to become useful to the human experience. What they did was recruit coal miners from coal mining parts of the country to come to Marshfield and dig the coal out of the Marshfield hills. Those coal miners came from places like West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and that Appalachian area, and many of those people were black. Several hundred blacks were recruited and lived in Marshfield to dig the coal out of those hills. Their descendants don't live there today because the pattern in Oregon is when labor is needed, it is recruited, it's migrated here. When it's no longer needed, those black populations are encouraged to depart from Oregon. That happened after Vanport, that happened in Marshfield at the turn of the 20th century. One of the things that discouraged those blacks to stay in Marshfield was this lynching that you're reading about on this page. A typical lynching, a black person accused of attacking a white woman, and frontier justice being applied. But I want you to pay particular attention to the last sentence of the description that occurred in the Oregon Journal, which was a competitor for being the leading newspaper in the city with the Oregonian in those days. The Journal is no longer with us, and the Oregonian practically no longer with us. But if you read that last sentiment, but the hand of justice had secured too strong a grip on the miscreant, and all the pleading in the world would not have saved him from the death he so thoroughly deserved. Okay, that's the sentiment from Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia, and that is the racial reality of Portland at the turn of the century as well. If you turn the page, Oregon had black newspapers, just like the Amsterdam News, just like the Chicago Defender, and a variety of other newspapers that kept these kind of stories alive on the national level. Oregon had local black newspapers that did the same thing for the Pacific Northwest. The most prominent black newspaper in the early part of the 20th century was the Portland Advocate, run by a black editor and a female black editor at the time. And what you see before you on this page is a report of a semi-lynching that took place in Oregon in the 1920s. The 1920s was a period of Oregon history when the Ku Klux Klan was the largest and the most influential and powerful social organization in the state. Again, we don't often assume that the Ku Klux Klan would play that kind of role in Oregon history. The Klan is a Southern story. But in the 1920s, the Klan was the most important social organization in the state of Oregon, electing a governor in 1923, electing many prominent members of the legislature, the Portland City Council, dominated by Klan influence. The Klan was the biggest social institution in the state, and the Klan in the state of Oregon engaged in all of the kind of Klan-related activities that they were known for in other parts of the country as well. This is a semi-lynching, meaning they didn't actually kill the black person who was the target of this lynching, from Oregon City in the 1920s, 1923. Now, it's from a microfiche, and it's hard to read, so if you turn to the next page, I've tried my best to give you the narrative that that newspaper article covers. Had to leave some empty spots there and make some guesses because it's a very bad copy, but I hope you'll be able to work your way through it. And what you will find is a typical Klan story here in Oregon. Black man accused of consorting with the white woman, visit from the Klan, taken to the countryside, strung up to a tree. The only difference in Oregon in the 1920 episode was that they didn't kill him. They hoisted him up on his tiptoes and kept him there as he strangled almost to death, but then they let him down and told him to get out of town. This is a typical Oregon version of this kind of Klan activity, and it occurred a number of times under the Klan in Oregon. I don't have an example of a Klan racial lynching here, but it was certainly possible. It was possible in this case. It was possible in many other kind of similar practice lynchings or semi-lynchings that the Klan was responsible for here. So at your leisure, you can read through that story. I want you to turn through the next page to another reality of racial history, of Klan history in the state that is similar, remarkably so, but also a little bit different because it is a reflection of Oregon's racial and cultural realities. The target of the Klan in Oregon in the 1920s was not a racial target. The biggest target of the Klan here was a religious target. Their target were the Jews and the Catholics who lived in Oregon. There simply weren't enough black people to go around to build a social movement against, but they found other targets. And in fact, the Catholic target of the Klan in Oregon was their most prominent and most viciously attacked target. If you read this incident, it's humorous in some ways. The Klan rode in Salem to a Catholic church there, and they were met at the door by a sister with a shotgun who ran them off. She recognized some of the Klan members, although they were in full regalia. She recognized the mayor of Salem at the time because he brought his dog along with him. She recognized the pickup truck of the sheriff. So she knew who the members of the Klan were. But again, an Oregon flavor to a far too routine story in the racial history of the country in the 1920s. I skipped one page that I don't want you to miss. I want you to go back to the page right after the 1902 lynching. That at the top says editorial from Oregon history. Journalism was very important in recording these stories and keeping these stories before the public and eventually bringing about the kind of racial change that helped create the Oregon that we live in today. But in the 1920s, an incident occurred in a small southern town called Grants Pass. One of the prominent white families had gone east on a vacation, had noticed that the fashion in the East at the time was to have black servants. Had hired some black servants and brought them back to Grants Pass. They were the only blacks living in Grants Pass at the time, and this is the editorial from the Grants Pass newspaper that encouraged them to depart. You can see as you read down through it that Oregon reflected the typical racial views of many other parts of the country at this time. But I want to call your attention especially to the highlighted capitalized letters that start with the N word about halfway down. Everybody see that section? Okay. We don't want you here, and we won't have you here. You had better roll up your bedroll and ride. This is to be a white man's country, yesterday, today, and forever. Who wants Grants Pass to be the scene of a race riot? Now, this editorial is pretty self-explanatory in some ways, but you have to understand what a race riot meant in the country in the 1920s to get the full impact of the story. The race riots of the 1920s, the 19-teens, the 30s and 40s were not like the race riots that we have today, where black communities basically self-destruct. A race riot in the 1920s was a mob invasion of a black community, killing and burning as opportunities presented themselves. So this editorial is threatening a race riot in Grants Pass in Oregon in the 1920s that is typical of other parts of the country. Now, I want you to at least conceptually put together that editorial with that Catholic episode from Salem to understand what this has to do with today. What this has to do with today, we call the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay? At the turn of the century, these kind of race riots made every black person a potential victim of racial violence. And most of that racial violence was going to be conducted by organizations like the Klan or more unofficial mob actions. Today, we have a slightly different situation. Turn forward to the part of the packet right after the Salem incident, and you will see an invitation to a lynching. But the difference being it's an official lynching. It is an official execution of a black man here in Portland in 1903, a black man married to a white woman who killed his wife. Okay? And this is the invitation to the lynching that was his ultimate fate for that behavior. What happens as we move deeper into the 20th century is that the unofficial behavior, the unofficial activities of organizations like the Klan and mob violence that we associate with these kind of lynchings in the South, there is a change of location, a change of origin for that kind of behavior. And the reason for that is that after World War I, when thousands of black men go to Europe to fight for democracy there, they learn the military arts. And they also come back to this country and notice that many of the kind of problems that they were fighting to eradicate in Europe, and this is true in World War I and World War II, are still problems in this country, and they're not going to be as likely to accept the kind of circumstances that they left behind. So those race riots that used to have scorecards like 89 blacks killed, one white person with a Band-Aid on his little finger have a different scorecard. Race riots become more dangerous for white participants. And so the responsibility for the racial violence of the 20th century is transferred to the official structures and functions of society. Now it's the police department that engages in the kind of racial violence that we see makes necessary a Black Lives Matter movement today. But it's racial violence nonetheless. So the history of race in this country, in this place that we live in Oregon, is intimately tied to the history of this institution of slavery, the practices that maintain that institution, and the mentality that made that institution an acceptable part of American society. And remember the fundamental realities of what a lynching was. A lynching was not just an individual act targeted at an individual participant, an individual victim. Lynching had a larger role and purpose in American racial history. What a lynching really said was said to the black population that this can happen to you at any time and in any place. You need to remember that. You also need to remember that when we do it, nothing will happen to us. Okay? Those are the realities of what lynchings were in the context of race relation, establishing that knowledge, establishing that kind of understanding on the part of a targeted population, and understanding that lynching was going to be a form not just of racial behavior, but of subordination and control. So, understanding those realities are a part of Oregon history as well as a part of these other locations in the country, and understanding the relationship to migration in a state that was created by migration and brought the same kind of racial mentalities and patterns of behavior here that existed in the places that from where they had departed. Before you can understand Oregon history, you have to understand those connections. So I'll end today. I think Dr. Ward will also engage in a question and answer session with us if you have those things and the time to engage in them today. You want to join me on the stage again?
open. There are folks in the audience who have questions. Yes.
So,
I can bring you this today.
okay, thank you. The invitation to the lynching, I'm just wondering if a white man committed a similar crime during that time period, what would have been the consequences? How would it have been different?
There were indeed whites who would have been killed for a similar action. Yes, if a white man killed his wife, he might have ended up with that public execution. But it was almost inevitable that a black man performing that same kind of behavior would. 12 whites were the jury. 12 white males were the jury. And there was no way that he was not going to be found guilty and executed. That might have differed if other circumstances and another victim might have been, might have been a part of that process. But there's no way he was getting out of that case.
Do you have a question? Oh, okay.
I would just add to this that capital punishment is a great place for the presentation and the conversation to end up, because that was a key component of Southern white anti-lynching rhetoric. There was a kind of Chamber of Commerce rhetoric of this is bad for business and this hurts our economy, law and order. But then another key part of the rhetoric that emerges in the South is why make the community look bad? Why embarrass yourself? Why put yourself at risk when we have a tried and true legal way of resolving this issue? And it wasn't, innocent until proven guilty. Let's see how this thing plays out. It was literally in an editorial saying, you say a black man killed a white man, you say a black man raped a white woman, that's a guaranteed execution. Just give the court, just give us a few weeks. We got that. So that was an anti-lynching argument. Let the state do it for you, and that's tricky. That creates its own problem, because when you're guaranteeing a legal resolution, we have multiple cases in places like Mississippi where there's a hung jury, or the Supreme Court stays in execution because the convict in the next cell confesses to the same crime the week before the execution, and then the mob shows up and takes the suspect and lynches them, right? So it just creates a cycle where when the state promises to resolve these issues for you through legal execution or lethal force, what happens when they don't follow through, and how does that affect your expectation of who the state serves and what they're expected to do about your perceived threats and enemies?
Yeah, I had a question. These were very, very powerful presentations, and I'm greatly in your debt for speaking as you did. You're making me think a little differently about an article I read yesterday in the art newspaper, which described the opening of the memorial in Birmingham, Alabama, to racial violence, in which they commemorate, maybe you had something even to do with that memorial's conception or creation, but 4,500 or so, just under that, lynchings are memorialized there. And it's a memorial park. And in one sense, it seems very appropriate that Birmingham, and this was part of the thrust of the article, given the history of Alabama and the South, would be the site of the memorial park. But I'm also now, having heard you, wondering if that can, in some unintended way, artificially locates the problem of racial violence again, reinforcing the idea this is a Southerners' problem. And that, of course, Birmingham would have such a memorial because that's where all these things were happening. And it kind of, I wonder if it may blunt some of the coming to terms with racial violence in places like Oregon and elsewhere that you so powerfully presented to us today.
I would add that there's one aspect of the memorial which very strategically and brilliantly takes this into account, and that's that I don't know if anyone saw Brian Stevenson guiding Oprah around the memorial on 60 Minutes, but he took her through the part where they have suspended stone monuments. So they're like rectangular, and there's one for every county, and it has all the victims from that particular county listed on it, memorialized on it. If you pan out, there's also what looks like just a bunch of knocked over, they're laying on their side, but there's a twin for every hanging monument in the memorial, the structure, with the roofed structure. There is a walkway where there are twins, carbon copies of these monuments laid out, and they have sent an invitation out to every one of those counties. There's a standing invitation for you to come pick up your copy and put it in front of the county courthouse, which is brilliant because like it's a race. It's a race in reverse. Like who's going to be last to have their monument just sitting there waiting to get picked up because that particular community refuses to acknowledge or to deal with that or to pay shipping. So that part of it's significant. I would say that the Equal Justice Initiative and that whole, because they released a report on lynching to build momentum for this opening, and like the statistics I showed, those statistics and that narrative, what they call racial terror lynchings, has to take into account numbers and volume. And so in that way, it is, geography and numbers are kind of an interesting part of this story because as we saw, you don't have to have numbers in order to have violence. And there's a history for why counties in the Mississippi Delta are 85% black to this day. Also a history why there are communities in Oregon that are 99.9% white to this day. And it's the same history, it's a shared history. But that's an interesting tension, certainly in how we memorialize racial violence. I think they have a pretty good plan for addressing that, but we'll see how that plays out and when the U-Haul trucks start showing up.
I think it's a very good point that you make because it reflects the way that we tend to create narratives around our past. And our national narrative is that, well, we've had some bad actors and some bad events. Most of them live in the South, but we beat them in the war. They still won't admit that, but we did. And so that's their problem, and we've kind of solved that. And I think it's completely appropriate for Birmingham to have that kind of memorial. I would never say, don't have one there. But if that is, if those are the boundaries of how we tell the story, then we're not telling the story of American race and American history. Because racial history was not just a black and white event in American history. We basically committed genocide against the native population. That was racial violence. Okay? In Californian history, more Mexican immigrants were lynched than blacks in California. In the Pacific Northwest, they had a race riot in Bellingham, Washington in the 19-teens that ran every person of Indian descent, not Native American descent, of Indian descent. They had a large resident Indian population out of the city, and they still don't live there today. There's an example of micro-racial cleansing. So if we limit our narrative description of what racial violence represents in American history to black-white incidents and black-white events, we are minimizing the role of racial violence. And we have to confront the role that violence has played in the country that we live in. We don't have to take responsibility for it because we didn't do it. Your only responsibility is for your own actions. But if we refuse to acknowledge it, we don't have an ability to understand the dynamics of race and culture that we still live with today. We're responsible for our actions, but we have to understand what created the world that we live in to know what kind of actions we have a responsibility for.
And I'll just add quickly that that's a synthetic challenge for people who write history books. I'm not aware of a book called A History of Racial Violence in America. And I didn't write one. It says racial violence in the title. But one of the things that I've had to confront and grapple with is that we don't have a synthetic narrative and a way to talk about racial violence as a broader phenomenon, because it affects different regions of the country and different vulnerable populations. And what we don't want to do is become imprecise with our terminology or euphemistic with our terminology and talking about race riots or talking about lynching. But the other thing we don't want to do is to simplify or marginalize stories of other communities, Filipino Americans, Chinese Americans, by simply saying this is all just the same expression of the same impulse or the same type of violence. That's a challenge, because there's a danger to just sort of leveling it out and making everybody part of the same story. But there is a broader narrative about racial violence in America that no one's really told, because we all have our own conferences and our own studies programs and regional histories that we gravitate towards, but also because it's a hard thing to do.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much. How to use this? Thank you very much for what you have shared with us. And I just heard both of the things that you said, which make me slow to ask what I'm going to ask, because I see that it is complex. But I want to suggest that, at least from what I've heard and what I've seen in Portland, this isn't history. This is the present. This is my assertion and question, because I'm not an authority on this, but Black Lives Matter has brought to my awareness that at least some of the people involved in Black Lives Matter see that the police as an institution is an extension of the original slave patrols, and that it is not simply a matter, as many of the white liberal people would like to believe, that there's some bad people on the police force. I think maybe you'll think it's extreme what I'm suggesting, but my feeling from what I've heard this morning and what I've seen and lived here in Oregon is that lynching now has become legal and done with guns and done by the police, and I would like your comments.
You know, it's a complicated question for a person of color. And we need police, okay? Society needs police. But we need a police function in which people who commit outrageous behavior are held accountable for that. And that's the problem with our police structure, our police culture right now. That the police know, just as the mobs knew, that didn't matter what they did, there'd be no consequences for it. That's the problem with our present police culture. And we, I think, systematically avoid addressing that reality. An incident occurs, an unarmed black person, innocent or guilty, is killed by the police. Doesn't matter, you know what the story will be. There are steps that will unfold in a predictable pattern and manner, and it will end in justifiable homicide. That's what's wrong with our current policing situation, that people who commit outrageous behavior know that there will be no consequences.
Doesn't that come from the culture that we still live with? Isn't that the violence that is the legacy that we have?
Yeah, and you know, there are so many details and nuances to that issue that we certainly don't have time to address in a lunch hour kind of conversation. But ultimately, I think it goes back to that. It goes back to the notions of who's a criminal and who's a responsible individual in American life, and how you respond to those different visions of a particular person. So yes, I think it's connected. I think there's definitely a connection.
Another piece of the memorial that's opening in Alabama in just a couple of weeks, April 26th is the grand opening, is that adjacent to the memorial is a museum that's opening at the same time, and the museum is called From Slavery to Mass Incarceration. The history of lynching is certainly somewhere in the middle, but that's an argument about, that's a historical argument, not necessarily a continuum, but a historical argument about how we get from point A to point B. And the one thing I would say about, in addition to this question of don't take the law into your own hands because the law will do it for you to your satisfaction. I mean, that becomes an argument against lynching. But the other thing that happens as the federal government and the nation is more critical of the South and pays more attention to lynching, and we see the numbers of recorded lynchings decline, is that there's an argument that civil rights organizations make through undercover investigators that lynching is going underground. It's changing. In 1940, the NAACP publishes a pamphlet based on a report from a white man who goes undercover for them in Mississippi called Lynching Goes Underground. And the argument was that because lynching is controversial, it's embarrassing, and increasingly it's a political liability. Lynch mobs are getting smaller, they're lynching under cover of darkness, and more than ever it requires the complicity of law enforcement, right? And this is how we get from 15,000 people on the courthouse lawn with picnic baskets who heard about the lynching the day before in the paper to the most famous lynching in American history, which is not a spectacle lynching in the 1890s, it's Emmett Till in 1955. And what happens to Emmett Till in 1955 is precisely that argument about lynching going underground, and it increasingly, not decreasingly, requires complicity of law enforcement, and law enforcement gets drawn deeper in these communities into being part of the violence and part of the cover-up, not the reverse. Also, anti-lynching legislation, which we never pass as a country, the penalties under these anti-lynching bills are not so much aimed at whodunit and locking up people who commit lynchings. It's monetary penalties and civil liability on the counties in which the lynching occurs and the law enforcement officials who are supposed to prevent them. That is what anti-lynching would have done. It would have punished police, it would have punished law enforcement for allowing this to happen on their watch and in their jurisdiction. So,
I would just like to reiterate one part of his comment. Lynching is still legal today. There is no national law against lynching today. Never been passed. I doubt if it ever will.
I'm going to borrow yours because all the batteries are dead in the other ones. So I think we'll take one and maybe two more questions. So, and then I think you all may be willing to stick around and hang out until speak independently.
I believe that we are experiencing a new frontier of hate as of late. And we are seeing an upswing in hate crimes, and hate is pervading our national scene, I think, very palpably. The history of genocide is full of reports of complacency, apathy, and indifference by bystanders who should have stood up and done something. What can we do to counter the current of hate that we see all too frequently and all too vigorously these days?
Listen closely, I'm going to solve that problem for you. No, the reality of confronting our history and the reality of facing difficult issues today and what we should do about them is not resolvable in a sentence or in an afternoon. Okay, we can do many things, but the many things are reflections of local circumstances. Okay, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is vote, and I suggest that might be true today. But as an individual, you have to evaluate both who you are and what you're willing to sacrifice, what you're willing to contribute, and what your local circumstances are. Everybody doesn't have to be Martin Luther King. Everybody doesn't have to give their life to move the needle forward on some of these kind of matters. But you do have a responsibility to do what you can figure out is the right thing. Okay? The only people that I have an objection to is the people who don't do anything. Okay? Even if what they want to do is different from what I think might be desirable, as long as people are doing something that they think is the right thing to do, then I can accept that. The only responsibility that we have is to avoid not doing anything, because there will be consequences, and those are unavoidable. What I think the greatest lesson of the study of history in this country is, for me, is that what is done to the least of us will eventually be done to all of us. And we have to understand and realize that. So if we don't want it done to us or our grandkids or our great-grandkids, we have to be willing to do something now. So try to figure out something that you think is going to be a positive contribution that will accumulate a response that will move us in the right direction, and do that. I can't give you any more specific advice than that. Just don't do nothing.
So I spoke last night in Corvallis because they're observing Holocaust Memorial Week, which they've done since the 1980s, and it's a great program. And the reason I was there was because they built in a comparative violence, comparative genocide aspect to this program. And also, it just so happened that in 1942, when those two boys are lynched, and Walter White can no longer go undercover because he's a well-known national civil rights figure, they sent a Jewish reporter down there from New York who had been he'd been the last bureau chief for the Jewish Telegraph Agency in Berlin, and was finally forced out in 1939. So he had covered Nazi Germany, and he goes back to cover the Nuremberg trials. And in between, he investigates and writes about lynching in Mississippi, and gets to talk to white officials and the governor, because he's a white guy. That matters more. Just like in Nazi Germany, it matters more that he's Jewish. In the South, it matters more that he's a white guy. And he's afforded the keys to the kingdom for that reason, and gets a lot of great stuff that a black reporter would not have been able to give. When he goes back to Nuremberg, he says something in his book, which is, I think, very important to this conversation, and that's that, he said, at Nuremberg, we heard a lot about barbarism and people being barbaric and all the barbaric things that human beings can do to each other. And he said, just like the word genocide is a creation of that moment in history, it's a new word. We need to recognize that this is a new form of violence that arose, right? That when we talk about barbarians, or we talk about the inevitability of racial violence when black folks and white folks are put in the same community, where there's this assumption that we just have these inborn hatreds and biases that lead us to just repeat history over and over. And what he was saying is important is that, Nazism was a new creation and a product of a social political disease called fascism, right? So there was an important reminder in that when we should know our history. We should not run from our history. We should learn history. But we should also really take into account that, we are facing an unfolding history and an unfolding future, and are dealing with new challenges. History can't save us, and it can't explain our way out of it. And I think that's very important to remember as well. I think there's a danger to just view anybody spouting off racist, intolerant, fascist-like rhetoric or policies as just history repeating itself or history coming back to haunt us. It is also a new threat that demands a new response. So that part of it, I think, is important, especially as a historian, because we're part of the problem. when people fail to recognize that they're actually living in the present and this is actually new and nobody knows what's going to happen and history can't explain or predict for us what is going to happen.
Did you ever, I'm going to take one last question and then I'll let you all go. But
To go back to history, my understanding is that rural and small-town Oregon was settled by people from the border states primarily, and some of the upper South. Did that create a...
Many people after the Civil War who migrated to Oregon came from the southern states, came from states like Missouri and Arkansas and Mississippi. And so they sought a comfortable location, a familiar location here, and they settled not in the cities, but in the rural parts of the state. So if you go to southern Oregon today, you're basically dealing with a descendant population from that Civil War generation in many ways. You know, that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I don't assume that everyone from the South is a bad person. I don't assume that if I hear a Southern accent, I have to run for cover, because there has never been a period in American history when people with that accent and people from that location have not been on the right side of these racial matters. Some people in those locations. They've been a minority in most cases, but they've been there. So I try not to judge people based on their accent or their location. I try to judge people based on their behavior. And I've traveled to every part of Oregon. I've traveled to eastern and southern and to coastal Oregon, and everywhere I've gone, I've met people who've wanted to do the right thing, and I consider that to be good. I consider that one of the reasons that I'm a racial optimist, in spite of studying American racial history. So, yes, I think it's fair to say that there are different racial cultures in different parts of the state, but I don't necessarily see that as any kind of obstacle or hindrance to us being able to continue to make racial progress in Oregon. Historically, historically, yeah, those different origins have been reflected in Oregon politics. When Oregon was going through its territorial period, moving towards statehood, practically every politician that represented Oregon on the national stage was a pro-slavery Southern Democrat. And for the next two generations, the people who dominated Oregon politics were former pro-slavery Southern Democrats. There's no way to avoid that. And so their racial policies, whether they lived in the cities or the country or served in the legislature or served on the Portland City Council, reflected that. But I don't think we're necessarily captive of that particular part of our history today. And I hope to be right about that, but I can't guarantee it.
all right, thank you both so much. Thank you all for spending time here today. Thank you for the excellent questions. I highly recommend The Hanging Bridge. There are copies available in the store. It's just a really wonderful book. And I do just want to say thank you for the comment about history helping us understand the present. Something about history repeats itself has always bugged me, and I think you just articulated why. So thank you very much, everyone, for being